The highlands were always deceptive. From the air, the land looked endless and calm. Soft green ridges, rice paddies gleaming like mirrors, rivers cutting silver lines through the jungle. But for the men who lived on those ridges, there was no calm, only the illusion of it. In 1969, Landing Zone Bragg stood like a blister on that landscape, a lonely hilltop carved out of the jungle by bulldozers and fire. The red soil stained everything it touched. Trucks, boots, uniforms, even skin turned the same shade of dull rust. When the roof of the bunker trembled under a near hit, Jennings ducked instinctively, clutching the radio like a lifeline. Dust filled the room, and the faint hum of electricity flickered in the wires. He looked toward the corner where his tape recorder sat. It had fallen from the shelf, a crack running along the plastic casing. For a moment he hesitated, part of him thinking it was absurd, another part knowing that the sound of that machine might be the only human thing left on the hill. Outside, the bombardment intensified. Men shouted over the explosions. Tracer fire cut through the darkness like burning threads. The generator sputtered, dimming the few lights still running. Jennings wiped the dust from the recorder, rewound the tape with trembling hands, and stared at the switch. The bunker smelled of metal and sweat. Somewhere above, another shell whistled down. When the blast hit, it was close enough to knock him against the wall. His headset flew off, the radio went silent, and the only sound left in the room was the faint ticking of the recorder spool turning in the dark. Jennings exhaled slowly, half in shock, half in resignation. Then, with the next rumble in the distance, he reached forward and flipped the switch, not to call for fire support or evacuation, but to bring something else into that chaos, the sound of home. The opening notes of a bass guitar hummed through the damaged speaker. Then came the brass, the groove, and the unmistakable voice of James Brown. The first line, "Say it loud," broke through the smoke and dust like a shout of life itself. Outside, the men heard it and froze, unsure if it was madness or salvation. Jennings just leaned back against the wall, eyes closed, letting the music fill the bunker as artillery thunder rolled over the hill. In that instant, the war didn't stop, but the fear did. For the first time that night, the hilltop didn't sound like death. It sounded like defiance. And on that lonely ridge in the Central Highlands, Sergeant Carl Jennings and his men would soon learn that sometimes survival came not from weapons, but from the rhythm of something greater, a sound that refused to be silenced. The first blast came like a punch to the gut. It landed just beyond the outer wire, a thunderclap that threw up a column of dirt and flame. Before the sound could fade, another shell hit closer. Then another. Within seconds, the entire ridge was under siege. The earth trembled with each impact, shaking the bunkers as if the ground itself were breathing. Men clutched their helmets and pressed themselves against sandbags, counting out loud between explosions, 1, 2, 3, waiting for the next. By 02 hours, the bombardment was a rhythm of violence, each detonation closer than the last. Inside the communications bunker, Sergeant Carl Jennings sat at the center of chaos. The radio hissed with static, a faint echo of distant transmissions, then silence. He twisted the knobs with gloved hands, slick with sweat, trying to catch any signal from battalion headquarters. The noise in his headphones shifted, a fragment of voice, a burst of interference, and then nothing. The line was dead. He cursed under his breath and looked up just as a shell hit somewhere near the perimeter. The concussion wave blew dust through the bunker vents, filling the air with the taste of cordite and earth. The next explosion tore open the roof. A blast of hot air and debris rained down on Jennings. He hit the floor, covering his head as shards of wood and metal clattered around him. Sparks flashed from the power unit in the corner, briefly illuminating the room in harsh orange light. The flickering stopped almost as quickly as it appeared, plunging the bunker into darkness. Jennings could hear the hum of the backup generator faltering, choking on fuel fumes. The tape recorder, which had been sitting on a makeshift shelf beside him, fell with a thud. He felt for it blindly, his hands brushing over the familiar metal casing. It was dented but intact. Outside, the sounds of war mixed into something almost mechanical. The distant whoosh of mortars, the staccato bursts of M60s, the low growl of the jungle itself trembling under impact. Jennings could hear the shouting of his comrades through the walls, orders lost in the din. A shell landed close enough to make the bunker floor lift beneath him, sending his coffee tin rolling across the room. He picked it up, his ears ringing, and realized with a strange detachment that he could no longer tell if the thunder outside was artillery or his heartbeat. Then came the hit that changed everything. The generator took a direct shock wave from a near miss and sputtered once before dying completely. The lights went out, leaving only the dim red glow of an emergency panel. The entire outpost went black. Jennings sat there for a moment in the silence between impacts, his mind running through every procedure. Backup comms, battery packs, field antenna. But none of it mattered. The equipment was fried. The only thing left alive in the bunker was the sound of his own breathing and the faint rattle of shell fragments striking the outer wall. The 1st Cavalry Division had taken the hill months earlier as part of a series of sweeps near the Cambodian border. It was meant to be temporary, a refueling and artillery support site, but as the fighting intensified, it became semi-permanent, a small, self-contained world of trenches, bunkers, and routines. Around 70 men rotated through the outpost, each one counting the days until rotation or reassignment. They called it the hill that never sleeps. Nights were long, days were longer, and every sound, a rustle in the grass, a snapped twig, the distant pop of mortars, kept their nerves wired. His hand brushed the recorder again. It was a reflex, a small act of instinct, maybe even madness. He had wound the reel the night before, ready to play a new tape when things quieted down. Now, without thinking, he twisted the knob, feeling the small click beneath his fingers. The reels began to turn, slow and uneven, the tape dragging through the worn machine. For a few seconds there was only static. Then, through the dust and smoke, came a bass line. Deep, rolling, alive. "Say it loud. I'm black and I'm proud." The voice hit the bunker like another explosion, but this one didn't bring fear, it brought life. The horns blared, the rhythm snapped, and James Brown's voice filled the darkness with something fierce and unmistakable. Jennings froze, half laughing through disbelief. The sound poured through the damaged speaker, bouncing off the metal walls, escaping into the night through the cracks in the roof. Outside, the reaction was instant. Men in the trenches stopped firing. A few laughed, others shouted, unsure whether the song was real or some hallucination brought on by adrenaline and fear. The jungle, moments ago alive with destruction, now throbbed with rhythm. The melody carried across the ridge, echoing between craters. "Say it loud!" Jennings heard someone yell from a nearby foxhole, their voice hoarse and half drowned in smoke. Then another voice joined in, and another. The chorus rose over the battlefield. "I'm black and I'm proud!" For a moment, even the enemy seemed to hesitate. The incoming fire slowed, then stopped altogether. In the eerie stillness, the only sound left was music. Raw, defiant, human. No one could explain why. Some would later say the North Vietnamese gunners paused, confused by the strange sound cutting through the night. Others claimed it was coincidence, that the bombardment had simply run its course. But for the men of LZ Bragg, it felt like something else. as if the jungle itself had stopped to listen. Jennings, still crouched in the bunker, turned up the volume. The tape wobbled from damage, the notes bending slightly, but the energy was still there. He could feel it vibrating through the floor, through his chest, through the very hill they were defending. For the first time in hours, he wasn't thinking about artillery or coordinates. He was thinking about the south side of Chicago, about neon signs and car radios, about life. The music reminded them all that they were still alive. The song played on, horns blaring, drums snapping, the bass line pulsing like a heartbeat. Some of the men started singing along, shouting the lyrics into the darkness. "Say it loud," one voice yelled again, this time louder, a cry not of fear but of pride. Others beat their helmets like drums, clapping hands against metal. Even those who didn't know the song felt its rhythm. The line between fear and defiance blurred until it no longer existed. When the reel reached its end, the tape clicked. Jennings, still grinning through exhaustion, rewound it and hit play again. The machine hissed, stuttered, and then the groove returned, louder, wilder. The second time around, the voices outside were stronger. "I'm black and I'm proud," they shouted, echoing into the jungle. The hill seemed to come alive, pulsing with sound instead of gunfire. After the second loop, the generator finally gave out completely. The bunker fell silent again. The tape wound down to a stop, the reels freezing mid-turn. Outside, there was no more shelling, no more shouting. Just the faint crackle of burning trees and the steady breath of soldiers who couldn't quite believe they were still there. Jennings sat in the dark, listening to the ringing in his ears, unsure if the quiet was real. He could still hear the song in his head, the words looping over and over like a heartbeat. "Say it loud, I'm black and I'm proud." He didn't know if the music had changed anything, but the silence that followed felt different. Not the stillness of fear, but of survival. Sergeant Carl Jennings had been there longer than most. A quiet man in his late 20s, he had the patience that came from working with radios, machines that demanded precision, not temper. He had been a factory worker back in Chicago before the draft pulled him in. His steady hands and calm voice made him indispensable. "If the net goes down, call Jennings," his platoon leader used to say, and they did. He could fix a transmitter with a piece of wire and a cigarette lighter. The ridge held that way for the rest of the night, wrapped in smoke and memory. Somewhere beyond the tree line, the enemy regrouped, puzzled by what they had just heard. On the hill, the men waited for dawn, their rifles close, their hearts still pounding to a rhythm that had, for one impossible hour, replaced the sound of war. Dawn broke slowly over the central highlands, a dull gray light pushing through the remnants of smoke. The jungle that had roared all night now sat still, silent except for the occasional crackle of something still burning. The mist carried the smell of burnt vegetation, diesel fuel, and wet earth, the scent of a battlefield after the storm. The men of Landing Zone Bragg crawled out of their bunkers, faces streaked with soot, eyes red from exhaustion. They moved cautiously at first, unsure if the quiet meant safety or another trap. The ground around them was scarred beyond recognition. Craters filled with rainwater reflected the pale light like shallow mirrors. Trees that had once surrounded the hill were splintered stumps now, their trunks charred and twisted. Empty shell casings littered the trenches, mingling with scraps of uniforms, torn maps, and shrapnel shards still warm to the touch. The outpost had taken more than 100 shells overnight, and yet, somehow, most of it still stood. Sandbags had burst open, walls had collapsed, but the men, against all logic, were alive. Sergeant Carl Jennings sat just outside his bunker, elbows on his knees, his headphones still looped around his neck like a piece of armor. The tape recorder, dented and coated in grime, rested beside him. He looked at it as if seeing it for the first time, the small machine that had somehow become the heartbeat of the night. Around him, soldiers emerged one by one, checking limbs, calling out names, trying to account for everyone. A few had bandaged arms or scraped faces, but there were no body bags to fill. For a night that had promised death, the morning brought only disbelief. Private Lawson was the first to break the tension. He stared at Jennings, half grinning through a split lip. "You really played that, huh?" he said, nodding toward the recorder. "James Brown in the middle of an artillery strike?" Jennings didn't answer at first. He just rubbed his palms against his knees, then shrugged. "Didn't plan to," he said. "It just happened." Lawson laughed, shaking his head. "Man, that's one for the history books." Word spread faster than radio signals. Within hours, soldiers from nearby platoons were calling in, asking if the rumors were true, if someone had actually blasted soul music in the middle of a bombardment. The story changed with each telling. Some said Jennings had turned the volume so high it echoed into the jungle, scaring the enemy into retreat. Others swore he had rewired the transmitter to blast the song through every field radio within miles. None of it was true, but the details didn't matter. The story had already begun to grow into legend. By midday, the company commander arrived. Captain Harlan Moore was a tall, lean man from West Texas, the kind who measured words carefully and emotion even more so. He walked the perimeter with his hands on his hips, surveying the damage. The hill looked like the surface of the moon. When he reached Jennings, he stopped. "Heard you caused quite a stir last night," he said flatly. "Music under fire, that right?" Jennings nodded, unsure whether to apologize or stand at attention. Moore stared at him for a long moment, the corners of his mouth twitching. Finally, he said, "Well, Sergeant, I don't know if it was regulation, but whatever it was, it worked." He turned and walked away, shaking his head, muttering something about a war with a soundtrack. The rest of the afternoon was spent in repair, digging new trenches, stacking fresh sandbags, fixing shattered antenna lines. The air hummed with the steady rhythm of work. Jennings and his team managed to restore partial radio contact by dusk. When the generator sputtered back to life, a cheer went up from the men. The lights flickered on for the first time in 20 hours. It wasn't much, but it meant they could hear each other again. That evening, as the sun sank behind the ridges, the outpost settled into a rare calm. The worst had passed, at least for now. The men cleaned their rifles, smoked what cigarettes they had left, and gathered around tin cups of coffee. Someone nudged Jennings and said, "Play it again, Sarge." He hesitated, then gave in. The tape clicked, the reels began to spin, and once again James Brown's voice spilled into the twilight. "Say it loud." The reaction was different this time. The men didn't laugh at first. They listened. The horns rolled, the drums snapped, and the rhythm filled the spaces where fear had been the night before. When the chorus came, "I'm black and I'm proud," a few voices joined in softly, then louder. Laughter followed, not mocking, but relieved. They weren't celebrating victory, they were celebrating survival. Inside the communications bunker, Jennings had created a small sanctuary. He lined the walls with maps and taped a faded picture of his younger sister next to the radio set. Beneath the table sat his most prized possession, a compact reel-to-reel tape recorder smuggled from Saigon during a supply run. On the reels were pieces of another life: James Brown, The Temptations, Aretha Franklin, Otis Redding. He played them in the evenings, low enough not to interfere with the radio frequencies, but loud enough for the men outside to hear. "That's Chicago soul, man," someone would say, grinning, and for a few minutes the war felt like it was 1,000 miles away. Jennings watched them as he leaned against the bunker wall. There was something remarkable about it. Men from different cities, different races, united not by command, but by a song that had cut through the noise of war. Even the white soldiers, who at first looked bewildered by the whole thing, started nodding along, tapping fingers against their helmets. Nobody talked about fear that night. Nobody talked about death. They just let the music fill the gaps that words couldn't. Later, when the generator shut off again to conserve fuel, the hill returned to silence. The men stayed awake longer than usual, talking in low voices, the faint echo of the song still clinging to the humid air. The story of the night's events was already mutating into something larger. Some swore the North Vietnamese troops had interpreted the song as a signal for reinforcements. Others believed it had been divine intervention, God's own DJ, one soldier joked. Nobody cared which version was true. They only knew that the shelling had stopped, and they were still breathing. As darkness settled once more over the ridge, Jennings returned to the bunker. He cleaned the dust off the recorder and set it gently beside his cot. The metal casing was scratched, one reel slightly warped, but it had survived, just like the men who had heard it play. He thought about writing a report on the incident, but there was no form for what had happened, no category for music stopping an artillery barrage. In the Army's language, there were only statistics, coordinates, and radio logs. Soul didn't fit neatly into any of them. Before turning in, Jennings stepped outside one last time. The jungle was quiet again, save for the chirp of insects reclaiming their night. Smoke rose in thin lines from the craters, drifting into the dark sky. Somewhere down the slope, a soldier hummed the song's chorus under his breath. Jennings smiled faintly. For all the destruction around them, there was a strange sense of peace, fragile, fleeting, but real. By the time the stars came out, the story of L.Z. Bragg was already leaving the hill, carried by messengers and rumor, by voices over the radio, by memory. Some said the music had scared the enemy. Others said it reminded them of home. But for the men who had been there, it meant something simpler. For one impossible night, they had found a way to turn noise into strength, and that, in a place built for chaos, was its own kind of miracle. By the end of that week, the story of what had happened at Landing Zone Bragg had taken on a life of its own. It spread first through radio chatter, half-truths passed between operators, distorted by static, amplified by imagination. Within days, men stationed at outposts miles away were talking about the night the music stopped the guns. No one knew exactly how it began, or even if the details were right, but the story traveled faster than any official report. In the barracks at Phuoc Vinh, someone swore they'd picked up the broadcast themselves, hearing James Brown's voice echo faintly across the open net. Others claimed the song had been blasted from loudspeakers across the entire valley. Every retelling made the event sound bigger, stranger, almost supernatural, as though the jungle itself had paused to listen. When a pair of war correspondents arrived from Saigon a few days later, they heard the rumor from a supply convoy driver. By the time they reached division headquarters, the story had already turned into myth. One journalist scribbled in his notebook, "The night the Viet Cong heard James Brown." It was catchy, memorable, the kind of headline that sold papers. The reporters never found Jennings or any of the men from L.Z. Bragg. They didn't need to. The story had grown beyond the people who lived it. Back at the outpost, Sergeant Carl Jennings wanted no part of the attention. He hated the fuss, hated the questions, hated hearing his name spoken with a smirk of disbelief. When his platoon sergeant joked, "Guess you won the war with a record player," Jennings only shook his head. "I didn't win anything," he said quietly. "Just played a song so we didn't lose our minds." But that explanation never stuck. In a war that offered few stories of hope, people clung to anything that sounded like one. For many of the black soldiers stationed across the 1st Cavalry Division, the story meant something far deeper. In 1969, the United States was still reeling from the assassinations of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert Kennedy. Race riots had burned through Detroit, Newark, and Chicago. In Vietnam, the tension followed them, in the mess halls, in the barracks, even in the way promotions were handed out. The Army might have been integrated on paper, but the lines between white and black soldiers were still visible everywhere. Against that backdrop, the idea of a black radio man blasting "Say It Loud, I'm Black and I'm Proud" in the middle of an artillery strike struck like a spark. It wasn't just defiance, it was affirmation, a declaration of identity shouted into the chaos of a war that so often erased individuality. At the division's rear base in Phuoc Vinh, the phrase began to appear everywhere. Someone painted "Say It Loud" in thick black letters on a mess hall wall. Another soldier scrawled it across the door of an armored personnel carrier. On supply trucks heading north, drivers chalked it across their bumpers. It wasn't rebellion, not exactly. It was morale, a way of saying we're still here. The days followed a rhythm that was equal parts monotony and chaos. Patrols left before dawn, wading through elephant grass slick with dew. By noon, the heat made the air shimmer. The soldiers came back soaked in sweat, rifles caked with mud. Then came the waiting, hours of stillness, watching the jungle for movement, listening to the static hum of distant artillery. Letters from home arrived once a week, if at all. Meals came in green cans that no one bothered to read anymore. Cigarettes were traded like currency. The only constants were the smell of damp earth, the mosquitoes, and the radio crackling in the background, connecting them to a world that no longer made sense. The officers noticed, of course. Some frowned, others quietly approved. Lieutenant Colonel Mendez, the battalion's operations officer, was asked whether it was appropriate for men to mark military property with slogans. His answer was pragmatic. If it keeps them fighting, I'll let them write the whole song on the side of a tank. For a brief moment, the line between discipline and expression blurred, and nobody seemed to mind. The strange thing was how quickly the message crossed boundaries. At first, it was mostly black troops who used the slogan, a quiet nod of recognition between men who shared the same exhaustion and alienation. But soon, white soldiers picked it up too, not as an imitation, but as solidarity. In the middle of the jungle, where everyone faced the same mud, fear, and loneliness, the song's rhythm spoke to something universal, a hunger to feel human again. A crew of mechanics even scratched the words onto the side of a maintenance shed in white paint. Beneath it, someone added in smaller letters, "Still loud, still proud." Meanwhile, Jennings continued his work in the communications tent as if nothing had changed. The brass eventually issued him a formal commendation for exceptional composure and communication discipline under fire. The language was sterile, deliberately vague. No mention of the tape recorder, or James Brown, or the odd silence that had followed the bombardment. To the men who had been there, though, the meaning was clear. When the platoon gathered to read the citation pinned to the bulletin board, they exchanged glances and grins. "Discipline under fire," one muttered. "Guess that's what we're calling funk now." Jennings said nothing. That night he sat on his cot and examined the tape recorder. The casing was dented, the right reel slightly warped, the label half torn. He had patched it with electrical tape to keep the mechanism running. The tape itself, the one that had played through the worst night of their lives, was coated in a thin film of red dust. He cleaned it carefully with a cloth and set it back into place. When he pressed play, the machine whirred unevenly before the music came, softer now, scratchy from damage. He didn't turn it up loud this time. He just sat and listened. The brass riff stumbled once. The vocals cut in and out, but the energy was still there. That defiant shout, that pride that refused to fade even under static. As the chorus came around, Jennings closed his eyes. He wasn't hearing the song anymore as music. It had become something else entirely, a marker of survival, a timestamp on the night the war changed for him. The men outside still told the story differently. Some said the tape had jammed just as the shelling stopped, that the timing was divine. Others swore they saw enemy spotters retreating through the trees as the first notes rang out. Nobody agreed on the details, but nobody wanted to. Myths were easier to live with than facts. For soldiers far from home, the legend of the music battle was more than entertainment. It was proof that even amid destruction, there could be moments that felt human, even sacred. In the weeks that followed, a kind of quiet reverence formed around the story. Whenever new replacements arrived, the veterans told it around the cook fires, their voices low, the details shifting slightly with each telling. The younger soldiers would laugh and shake their heads, but even they could sense the weight behind it. They didn't care whether it was true. They just wanted it to be. In a war of numbers and coordinates, this was a story that belonged to them, something unmeasurable, something unrecorded. By September, the tape had become part of unit lore. Someone suggested sending it back home to a stateside radio station, but Jennings refused. "It stays here," he said. "It belongs to the hill." And that was that. When the next supply convoy rolled out, the men painted a new phrase on the side of their Jeep. Say it loud, Bragg still stands. Under the noise of helicopters and the endless hum of generators, the song's echo lingered, not through speakers, but in the rhythm of footsteps, in the scrape of shovels rebuilding trenches, in the low voices of men who had learned that even music could hold a line. And somewhere far from that hill, in base camps and bars and letters home, the rumor continued to grow. It wasn't about Sergeant Jennings anymore, or even James Brown. It was about the moment when the artillery stopped and the world, for just a heartbeat, listened. In early August, whispers started moving through the unit, reports of increased enemy activity west of the border. Scouts had spotted movement, too organized to be local guerrillas. Command said it was nothing to worry about, but the veterans knew better. The jungle had its own ways of warning. The birds went quiet at night, and strange lights flickered far beyond the perimeter. On August 11, the first artillery rounds landed a few miles away. On the 12th, they landed closer. By the morning of the 13th, everyone on the hill was tense, checking ammo and digging deeper trenches. When the war finally ended, the men of Landing Zone Bragg went home to a country that had changed as much as they had. Some arrived to quiet airports where protesters still waved signs and shouted slogans. Others came home to silence, their uniforms folded away before they reached the front door. There were no parades for the 1st Cavalry, no speeches, no closure. Within a few months, the unit that had once lived shoulder to shoulder on a muddy hill in Vietnam scattered across America, to Detroit, Houston, Newark, Birmingham, and 100 other places where the jungle was just a bad dream trying to fade. Carl Jennings returned to Chicago in the spring of 1971. He took a small apartment near the South Side, found work repairing radios and television sets, and kept mostly to himself. The sounds of static, the hum of old circuits, they were steady, predictable, unlike the noise of war. Sometimes, when a customer dropped off a broken reel-to-reel deck, he'd take an extra moment before opening it, as though half expecting to find the old tape from Vietnam waiting inside. But he never played the real one again. The tape, the same worn, dust-caked reel that had spun through the bombardment, stayed in a box at the back of his closet, wound tight and silent. Every now and then, someone from the old unit found him. They would call or send a letter first, then show up at a bar off Roosevelt Road or a small VFW hall on the outskirts of the city. The conversations were always the same, short on ceremony, long on memory. They'd talk about patrols, the smell of wet canvas, the bugs, the waiting. And inevitably, someone would bring up that night. "You remember when the whole damn hill sang James Brown?" one of them would say, a grin tugging at the corner of his mouth. The others would laugh, a tired, knowing laugh that came from somewhere deeper than humor. It wasn't a punchline, it was a kind of proof. Proof that even in the middle of a place built to erase them, something alive, something joyful, had found its way through. The tape itself became a relic. At their first reunion, held in 1975 in Dallas, Jennings brought it with him, tucked in a small plastic case wrapped in an old army cleaning cloth. The men passed it around carefully, touching the edges like it was a medal. Nobody dared to play it. It had grown too fragile, the reel warped from heat and time. But holding it was enough. The sight of that gray tape, scuffed and patched with electrical tape, carried them all back to the bunker, to the moment when sound had replaced fear. Historians, years later, would stumble across brief mentions of the event in the archives. In one after-action report from August 1969, a single line appeared beneath a section labeled Morale and Communications. "Unit morale response effective under artillery engagement. Sustained cohesion observed." That was all it said. No mention of music, no names, no song. To military analysts reviewing the report decades later, it was little more than an odd anecdote, a statistical blip in a war filled with anomalies. But for the men who had been there, it wasn't an anecdote. It was memory. They could still feel the way the ground had shaken, the smell of cordite and rain, the static hum before the first note played. They remembered the sudden quiet that followed, how the shelling stopped as if someone had cut a switch, how the air itself seemed to hold its breath. When Jennings tried to describe it years later, he struggled to find the words. "It wasn't like it scared them off," he said once in an interview with a local paper. "It was more like, I don't know, like the world just stopped yelling for a second." Most of the men moved on. Some built lives that looked normal from the outside. Jobs, families, small houses. Others drifted, caught between the war they'd left behind and the country that didn't want to hear about it. But whenever they found each other again, at reunions, in veterans' halls, or in the rare letters they still wrote, that night on the hill always surfaced. It had become more than an event. It was a story they carried like a flag that never needed raising. For many of the black veterans especially, the song meant more with every passing year. Back home, the civil rights movement had evolved into something else: pride, empowerment, the demand to be seen. They recognized, in retrospect, that the song Jennings played had been more than just background noise. It had been a declaration. In Vietnam, it had echoed through smoke and fear. Back home, it became part of a larger chorus, a sound of a generation refusing silence. Jennings never called himself brave. When asked about it decades later during a small oral history project at a local university, he smiled and shook his head. "We were scared out of our minds," he said plainly. "But when that music played, we remembered who we were. It wasn't about bravery, it was about remembering." He paused, rubbing his hands together, the movement small and mechanical. "You can't shoot music," he added. "You can try, but you can't." As the years passed, their numbers thinned. By the 1980s, fewer men came to reunions. Some had died young. Others disappeared into the kind of quiet that only veterans know. Jennings kept the tape, but refused offers from journalists or museums to donate it. When a historian from the Smithsonian called to ask about preserving it as part of a Vietnam sound archive, he declined politely. "It's not history," he said. "It's ours." Jennings worked through the morning repairing a damaged field antenna. Each time he looked up, the horizon seemed smaller, swallowed by smoke and mist. "Feels like the calm before the storm," one private muttered. Jennings didn't answer. He had learned that fear rarely needed words. Around noon, a supply helicopter dropped off crates of rations and a few new batteries for the radios. Inside one crate, tucked between boxes of C rations, Jennings found a roll of blank magnetic tape, a small luxury in a place where music mattered more than sleep. He smiled for the first time in days. Still, the legend endured. Among veterans groups, the music battle of 1969 was sometimes retold as a parable, a small, strange story that represented something larger about the war. Some called it luck. Others called it faith. A few insisted it was tactical psychology, though no one could explain how a song could still artillery. But within those circles, among men who had heard the jungle roar and fall silent, it was something purer, a reminder that humanity could survive even in its loudest and most violent hour. Jennings lived quietly into his 70s. He married once, briefly, and spent the rest of his life fixing radios and teaching neighborhood kids how to solder circuits. He never hung his medals, and the only photograph from Vietnam he kept was a faded Polaroid of L.Z. Bragg taken from the air, a small clearing ringed by jungle, barely visible through the haze. On the back, written in his neat, careful hand, were 3 words, "Still standing, 1969." In his later years, when old friends called or dropped by, he would sometimes pull out the tape from its box and set it on the table. They wouldn't play it, the reel was long past usable, but they'd sit and stare at it for a while. "You know," one of them said once, "I still hear it sometimes, like it's still playing somewhere." Jennings smiled at that, nodding slowly. "Maybe it is," he said. "Maybe it never really stopped." The tape never did make it into a museum. After Jennings' death in 2012, it was found still in its box, stored beneath a folded American flag and a yellowed newspaper clipping about the war. No one knows what became of it after that. Perhaps it was lost. Perhaps someone kept it. But for those who remembered, the sound never needed preserving. It already lived inside them, looping endlessly like the chorus of a song that once drowned out the war. And for those who were there that night, in the mud, in the dark, listening to a reel-to-reel hum under the shell fire, that song would always mean one thing, that even when the world turned to chaos, a single voice could still remind them who they were. By the time the story re-emerged, most of the men who had lived it were gray-haired, their uniforms long stored away, their medals gathering dust. It began quietly, a passing mention in a university thesis about sound and morale in the Vietnam War. Then, in the early 2000s, a filmmaker researching a documentary on music in wartime stumbled upon the account. Buried in an old Army transcript, she found a brief line about a spontaneous morale event during an artillery bombardment in August 1969. It was vague, unverified, and irresistible. She tracked down anyone she could find from the 1st Cavalry Division, following names through veterans associations, church bulletins, and faded phone books until she reached Chicago and Carl Jennings. By then, Jennings was in his 70s. His hearing wasn't what it used to be, and his hands shook slightly when he picked up a cup of coffee. But when the filmmaker asked about the tape, his eyes lit with the same quiet energy that had carried him through that night half a century earlier. "Yeah," he said after a long pause, "that happened." He laughed once, low and dry. "But I don't know if it was the song or just the timing. Maybe both." He agreed to the interview on one condition: you tell it like it was, no hero stuff. The documentary crew filmed him in his small workshop on the South Side, surrounded by radios in various stages of repair. The camera lingered on the table beside him, the old reel-to-reel deck, now rusted and silent, its brand label almost unreadable. When the interviewer asked if he ever tried to play the tape again, Jennings shook his head. "It's dead," he said simply. "But I still hear it, you know? Every time I smell smoke or hear thunder, I hear that bass line start up again. When the film aired in 2008 under the title The Soundtrack of War, it caught audiences off guard. Viewers expected a study of protest songs and morale-building broadcasts, but instead they found a story that blurred the line between myth and memory. The segment about Landing Zone Bragg lasted barely 10 minutes, but it resonated. Footage of old veterans laughing softly as they recalled the night the shells stopped struck a chord far deeper than statistics or strategy ever could. One clip showed Jennings and 3 of his former comrades sitting together for the first time in decades. Their faces were lined, their eyes wet with memory. When the reporter asked if the enemy really stopped shooting because of James Brown, they exchanged glances and smiles. "Who knows?" Jennings said at last, leaning back in his chair. "But for a few minutes, it felt like they did, and that's enough." The others nodded silently. It was the only answer that ever fit. That evening, clouds gathered. The jungle darkened early, the air heavy with rain. The men moved like shadows around the camp, checking sandbags and machine guns. Jennings took his post in the bunker, headphones on, scanning frequencies. The static was relentless. Reports came in from other positions, light contact, probing fire, then silence. He logged each one carefully, his handwriting small and precise. Outside, thunder rolled, and someone cursed at the sky. Historians began referencing the events soon after. Some labeled it an unverified morale anomaly, others a psychological coincidence. In academic papers, it appeared alongside discussions of wartime radio use and the cultural identity of African American troops. No one could confirm what truly happened. No operational logs matched the timeline perfectly, and the recording itself had long been lost. Yet the absence of proof only strengthened the story. Like so many things from Vietnam, it survived because it was told, not because it was recorded. Museums began to echo it too. In the Vietnam exhibit at the National Museum of African American History and Culture, a black and white photo shows a group of soldiers crouched beside a radio tower. One of them, head bowed, hand on a tape deck, bears an uncanny resemblance to Jennings. The caption reads simply, "Say it loud, L.Z. Bragg, 1969." Visitors often linger there longer than anywhere else. The image carries a quiet gravity. No weapons, no explosions, just men and a song that somehow mattered enough to remember. For those who had lived it, the meaning went far beyond coincidence. The men of Bragg never claimed that the song ended the attack. What it did, they said, was give them something the war had been stripping away day by day: control. In the midst of chaos, when the world was shaking itself apart, a few seconds of rhythm had reminded them of who they were. It wasn't about politics or defiance. It was about identity, about being alive, being loud, and refusing to disappear. In the years following the documentary, veterans' gatherings sometimes played "Say It Loud, I'm Black and I'm Proud" during memorial events. It wasn't official, no marching band, no flag presentation, just a moment when the speakers hummed, the horns kicked in, and heads began to nod almost unconsciously. White and black veterans alike would look at each other, smiling faintly. They might not have been there that night, but they understood it. Every war, every generation has its own anthem, something that cuts through fear, through distance, through silence. Jennings never sought recognition. He died quietly in 2012, a few years after the documentary aired, his story sealed into the history he had once tried to avoid. At his funeral, one of his old platoon mates placed a small object on the casket before it was lowered, a reel of magnetic tape, brittle and flaking. The writing on the label was faded, but a single word was still legible: loud. The pastor didn't mention it, and the family didn't ask. They all knew. After his death, interest in the story surged again. Students wrote theses about it, filmmakers reenacted it, musicians sampled it. The legend of the Music Hill became part of the unofficial folklore of the Vietnam War, not a tale of victory or strategy, but of humanity persisting in the unlikeliest place. Historians debated its details endlessly, but the veterans who had stood under that barrage were long past arguing. For them, the truth was simple. It happened. Maybe not exactly as remembered, maybe not exactly as told, but it happened. And even if the physical tape was gone, the echo remained. In letters, in interviews, in the way younger soldiers spoke of resilience and identity, the rhythm still lived. The night the shells stopped was no longer just about one song or one man. It had become a symbol of endurance, a reminder that sometimes, even on a hill surrounded by fire, survival can sound like a beat carried through the smoke. Today, in classrooms and documentaries, the story is told with quiet reverence. Professors cite it as an example of cultural cohesion under fire. Musicians see it as proof that art doesn't just reflect history, it shapes it. And visitors to museums still stop at that photo of the men at Bragg, reading the simple caption, "Say It Loud, 1969." They rarely move on quickly. Something in that moment, frozen, uncertain, but full of life, still speaks louder than words. For those who were there, the story will never be about superstition or chance. It was about pride. It was about survival. It was about the strange, unexplainable power of music to hold people together when everything else falls apart. That night, when the shells fell silent and a song filled the jungle, they believed, for one fleeting, impossible moment, that their voices, loud and unbroken, could make even war go quiet. And in that belief, the legend was born. At 20 hours, the first artillery shell landed near the perimeter, sending a column of dirt and smoke into the air. Then came another, closer. Within minutes, the ridge was under bombardment. The earth shook with each impact. Jennings hunched over his radio, shouting coordinates into the mouthpiece, trying to reach battalion command. Static answered back. The line was dead. He switched to backup frequency, adjusted the dials, and tried again. Nothing.